Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here with another Product Growth Leaders Conversations. Steve, I have to thank you. A couple weeks ago, you recommended this little yellow book here, The Right It, to me.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, it may be the best product management I read since, a book next to it.
There we go.
Ideas in the product. But it really got me thinking about how bad I did at validating concepts when I was a product manager and product leader, and went back to our logs, and we have not talked about validation for over 2 years. I think it was like fall of 2020, not 2020. But the more we talk about something, and we're doing some stuff now, validation is probably one of these critical things that product managers should be thinking about often.
Agreed. And yet, as we've talked about before, for many product managers, the idea of validating is just a foreign language, largely because many product managers don't ever engage with customers or potential customers.
Yeah. And if we look at product management as a risk management role, isn't validation one of the critical tools we should be using for risk management? So
Definitely.
we are going to be talking about validating product ideas this week. And on Monday, we put a question in the community. How do you best use validation to improve product success? Danny Maravellis, who could not be with us, came through with a great list, as she always tends to. Restate, articulate the discovery effort and validation to clearly define the problem they're solving. Map the discovery and validation back to your strategy. Formulate a hypothesis and plan to conduct further validation. Test, check your assumptions and hypotheses. Focus, implement, measure, report, adjust. Very clear, consistent. Let's do this. We need to do this as part of it. And Paul Hatala, over the past couple of months, you've been bringing fire in your answers in the community and in the poll. And every week I keep going, God, I hope Paul joins. God, I hope Paul joins. And I'm so glad to have you back. And we've missed you. For validation, you tend to look at the world through the sales lens and consider things that will prevent revenue from being realized. And to me, I thought that was an amazing, I always tend to look at it from the idea, sort of almost from upstream to downstream, and where I like the idea of looking at the other way. Talk to me about your thoughts.
So I think that's probably from the Roger Martin school of strategy of what are the things that could fail and how about we don't do those things. And so I've been in enough development and customer facing roles where I've looked back and said, boy, we could have done this a lot better 6 months ago. And now I'm that guy making those decisions 6 months ago. So looking at it and saying, how can I make our teams, our development and our sales teams' lives a lot easier whenever we are getting ready to go to market? Do I have an answer for them on the who, the why, and the why nots?
Yeah, and well, with me quoting Roger Martin or Peter Drucker always gets an automatic nod.
That's why I always have them ready to go.
But I think it's it's really nice because if we do our validation well, we almost create validation questions for sales, right?
Yeah,
we can go through and understand these things that we think, and we can help them better enable. And Steve and I were talking with Barb Nelson from our team yesterday, and over time we've realized that in sales win-loss analysis and interviews, we find that sales enablement sometimes is always the worst, is the biggest area of improvement where you can make the most impact. So I love this idea of looking at through lens and the sales lens and see what can we do and how can our validation help with that. So which takes us all the way through to validating our messaging and our positioning and even what we do with presentations. It's not just validating it up front, it's validating all the way through the cycle.
I think Drucker might have also said something about it's just obvious to the customer that it's for them.
Yeah, the only person who can tell you what the customer values is the customer themselves, is what Drucker said. So I think that's an incredible way to do that. May, you shared a great piece from Edamar Galad on the confidence level, and actually in the Right It, he talks about building some level of confidence indicator for that. So talk to me about your thoughts.
So Itamar wrote a piece about how do you measure your actual level of confidence, and the article goes through the different stages at which point to do discovery, in order to affirm your assumptions. Now, depending on which phase it is, you get a better picture of like how confident should you be about what you think you know. And I think it's important to realize that everything that we know is what we think we know, right? Unless if it's, purely logic factual, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that doesn't exist. And I think it's important to recognize that some of the things we think we believe are actually just assumptions, right? And but it doesn't make sense to go and validate everything all the time. There are some things that are safe to assume and some things that aren't, but I think it's good to take a step back and think about it. Now you'll hear that in my response I did not say the word validation, because the word validation is actually really, really heavy from a classic industry perspective, because when the first corporate job I've ever had was in a pharmaceutical company, and if you say the word validation, it is like process upon process upon process of like, everything has to be signed 3 times and then signed by the upper management. Like
Hmm.
it is a heavy, heavy thing. And then when I joined the software company, they actually had a validation team, but it had nothing to do with the customer idea. It had everything to do with those models that we built. So there are important it is important to differentiate what we mean by validation here. Like, are we trying to validate our assumptions, at which point would it not be better to say we are confirming our assumptions?
Yeah.
Because like the thing about validation is, if you want to validate one idea, your result is a yes or no. Whereas if you switch the terminology around and say we're not validating this idea, we are making sure we are confirming that this is actually the right thing for the market, or like we are seeing how the product performs in the market, then you get more answers than just a yes and no. And you are no longer performing a validation exercise, you are performing a discovery exercise. So
Gosh,
thank you.
so many places I want to go with this, and one of them is I need to look at some of our stuff when we talk about validation, maybe change the terminology. But the first one was, it made me think about Roger Martin, where he says maybe we need to flip it, what we're validating, instead of what is not. It's like he talks about what would have to be true. So if we can understand what would have to be true for something, it's not. It gets a little away from the hypothesis and the pure scientific method of validating a yes/no hypothesis. The second was in his latest book, Bob Mesta, in his Learning to Build, which is his latest book, he talks about too often when we do experimentation, we're doing A/B trade-offs that don't take into consideration other factors. And I loved your idea of how we need to get away from just this yes/no and maybe look broader than that. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I would like to point out that there is a legitimate case for the validation, especially in highly regulated industries.
Mhm.
There are places where you do want validation, where you do want that yes, no, and there are places where you don't want that yes, no, or don't want that to be the confines of your outcome.
Well, and even time, go ahead.
Could you validate your assumptions? Or not just do market discovery, but say, our assumptions were, and the critical assumptions were, A, B, C, and then validate those individually.
So here's the thing. It's like, if you're testing, will A make an impact? Why not change the wording around and say, what is the impact of A on the market, right? So the outcome you're looking for is not a yes or no answer.
Well, and too often when we do, at least when I see these surveys, and we'll talk about that when we get to our poll, people are using a Likert scale 1 to 5 and using a 5 or numbers of 4 and 5 as their validation. And they're asking a yes, no question and not giving a yes, no option in the answer. I saw one company using, if they said 5, that means they're willing to pay. I'm like, how do we know that if they said it's very important, they're willing to pay? It just is something they see as very important. One thing I like to do is when we set up these tests, I don't like yes, no tests, but what are the validation what levels do you have to get to? Let's use these things and put them. And if you don't put, I was talking to a client yesterday, I'm like, too often we do a survey and we never set what is the threshold. Okay, 60% have to be important or very important for us to say this is a good idea. They don't put that down there. And then it comes in at 40s. They're like, oh, that's not bad. I thought it was gonna be higher, but it's not bad. So part of it is gonna be, how do we make sure we set some thresholds with this when we do? I got so many things in my head right now. I'm gonna give myself time to process by going to Dutch. Dutch, well, Dutch started off the easy way that anybody could always start with. I agree with May. I mean, that's sort of a given.
I think I'm a 50-50 on that. Usually when I follow May, she says very similar to what I'm thinking, or just paraphrases it differently. But yeah, I do agree that validation is the yes, no. And so how to best use validation is to go from that validation binary choice of yes, no into a discovery, basically saying, hey, does this solution resolve the situation, problem, pain point, challenge, whatever word you're trying to use? Does this solve the problem we're trying to solve for? Yes or no? Well, how well does it solve for that? Is there anything else, now that you have this opportunity and the value that we're providing you, what else can be gone from this point now that we've checked that box of validation? So it just goes right into the learning aspect of discovery after you've validated with a yes, no.
And with Paul's comment on sort of the sales side of it, some of those problems we're going to ask are, does the prospect understand the value we deliver? Do they understand the problem can? So sometimes it's not always the problem in their lens. What problem do they have? It's, do we solve their problems? Do we communicate properly? And I think that I love that view of it. And I do agree. You said, we should be delivering, validating throughout the process, throughout the life cycle. And that's one thing we lean into and we talk about a lot. Clint, you go right there, right? For validation to be really effective, it's required through the development process and because of shifts and disruptions. Talk to me about what you're thinking.
So really, kind of in line with everybody else, it has to have value. So, my perspectives on that is that if you don't do it, there's a possibility of
Clint, I think you froze. All right.
if you do and then you don't follow up with it, it can really detrimentally impact the launch of your product, the performance of the business case, customer satisfaction. So, we talked during discovery about different vehicles, and if you've got a big budget, if you've got a small budget, you can do qualitative, you can do quantitative. So one of the things I did when I didn't have a big budget is that we had a small group of customers that was based on the different market segments. So we had large customer, medium customer, small customers, typically 2 or 3, and we had a grouping. And even though they may have competed with each other, the feature set that we were looking to validate had value to all. So we would either do them in a group or we would have individual one-on-one meetings, and we do it monthly or bi-monthly and leverage their feedback on kind of iterative validation. So it was really a great tool, didn't cost anything. And it also brought the customer much closer to you because you're investing in them relative to the value of their feedback in your development cycle. So it really had a benefit in 2 ways, in that they provided you with very insightful feedback, and collectively they are also potential candidates for new products and new features, whether it be an extension or a ground up new product development. So I think it's a real critical aspect of the overall development process. And you can have a lot of different vehicles. If you've got a bunch of money, then you can do more of a quantitative, or you can do either the yes, no, or I'm actually more of a fan of the 1 to 5 versus a hard yes or no, because a lot of times the customer don't know, and they may lean to an area. If they're not comfortable, they may give you the wrong answer. So that's why I like having a group that you can basically communicate with on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. That may or may not be possible depending on the product or the scope. Typically for larger capital equipment where you're not doing huge volumes, it's something that's more realistic versus if you're doing a software product for thousands. But again, it really depends on the application. But
Completely agree. And I love the idea. I used to call it the friend DA, right? We want the things that we can share may not have an NDA with them, but we trust them because they're a partner. They've been doing this type of stuff with us, and it's a great way to do it.
The one other thing that resonated was about, if it's a value, would you pay for it? And the customers would say yes. You can't walk away with that as an answer, right? So we were developing a program that would basically do self-diagnostics, and it would provide all sorts of performance metrics and literally tell a customer what machine, what job, and what operator would best run it. And they were like, yeah, this is great. This is phenomenal. And then this wasn't my project. They rolled it out and nobody wanted to pay for it. So it was like they didn't do enough due diligence up front on what's the value relative to the payment. And is there enough benefit, even though it's a great idea and everybody was overly optimistically enthused about it, come time to execute against that, it just didn't go anywhere. So it may have now, but over the course when we developed it, it just didn't work out.
Yeah, I found that surveys are not a great way to find true buying intention. One of the things in the Right It is he talks about prototypes, which is a pretend prototype. Without building, can you do something to see if people will put money down? Time is okay, money is better. And that really gets to something under that. The other thing that I thought about, I like Likert scales, but when I'm talking through multiple problems to solve or things that value points, I also like a stack rank with it, because if you get a whole bunch of 4.5s, right? How do we know which of the 4.5s would be preferred in order? But I guess that's a cheap person's conjoint analysis. But
you can always go back. I mean, what we did after, if we did that, then we go back and accumulate the data. We would basically do that, and then we would say, hey, can we come back to you and help you have you guys stack rank? So that was another part of the process as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Clint.
You bet.
Leslie, welcome to the conversation. So glad to have you here. Love to get your take on this. How do you best use validation to improve product success?
This is something that's been on my mind quite a bit lately, because we have been working on a new product, and we're trying, it's really more than a new product. It's like a new market, and it's involved with, there's a lot of change management around it and so forth. So the way we've decided to go about it, we had started looking at surveys and various ways to gather input, and really found that doing more, it takes more time, but doing those detailed voice of customer interviews, one-on-one with customers, giving them trial access to what we're coming up with, and really diving into where they're seeing the value, I think and it's changing our perception a little bit. And I think that's something that you have to keep in mind is, you start off and you've created this product with certain goals in mind and certain things, but you've always got to keep an open mind to question those and make sure that you're on the right track and adjust if needed, depending on how the data comes out that you do collect, whether it's through a survey or through conversations or through some kind of stacked rank or whatever method you want to use. And I think that's really important to keep that open mind. I actually years ago worked for a company that they had a mantra. They created solutions for the distribution center, and they were voice only is the way to go for years and years. That was their mantra. It was voice recognition only, voice driven workflows. And they did a lot of research, engaged a third party to help us do a lot of research, and interviewed existing customers and people who weren't our customers. And they had to keep an open mind when it came back that people were really thinking, well, voice combined with scanning is actually more efficient. It was a real paradigm shift for the company, and being able to embrace that feedback and make that change. I mean, a lot of our resellers are like, wow, I would have never thought that you made that change. But you have to listen to the customers. You've got to listen to the pain points and the value that you're providing, and make sure your solutions are going to meet those needs.
Completely and totally. So side note, we're going to have a conversation because I was the head of RFID standards at GS1 US. And so I probably know the company you're talking about because we had a
You
lot
probably
of those people,
do.
we had a lot of those people in our partner programs. But bringing it back on course, I started off saying I probably was really bad at validation. I didn't do the surveys as much. I probably didn't do, but I did conversations. And so your voice of the customer type stuff. Once I had an idea, and we'll get to this a little more in the poll, it was talking through people about the concepts, right? Here's what's on my mind. Here's what we're thinking. Here's what I understand. And sometimes those personal conversations can do a very good job of validation. And sometimes, to Clint's point, if you don't have the budget to do it, sometimes you need to find your own way of doing it. I was talking to a good friend who's a UX lead yesterday, and he said, the most important stuff for him, and this goes to you're talking about the voice control with scanning, was going and spending time. He and the head of product went out and actually spent time with the customer and watched their processes and found stuff. I remember Jason Weber, who's been on these calls, talking about people building computers for industrial equipment and not taking into consideration the environmental factors of dust and dirt and stuff like that. It's like, if you're not out there, there's so many things we should be able to do. Great. Thank you for your great first take. Steve, I got so much in my head and I'm hoping you help me clarify it.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but as I was listening to everyone else, I was reminded of the debacle that was known as New Coke, which was they wanted to validate that everybody loved New Coke. And the problem was they did it wrong. They gave you a blind taste test. Here's old Coke, here's Pepsi, here's New Coke. Which one do you like better? Which one is your favorite? And everybody chose New Coke because well, two things. One, people always choose the sweetest drink. What they didn't ask is what kind of brand loyalty do you have to Coke? I'm one of those people who go to a restaurant and I'll say, can I have a Coke? And they say, well, we have Pepsi. And I'm like, I'll have tea. Yeah. Pepsi's terrible. Everyone knows that. But I'm also from the South, so maybe that's part of it. But anyway, what they didn't do is apparently they gave everybody in the taste test a case of New Coke to take home with them. And they never thought to circle back around. And it turned out no one ever finished their case of Cokes because it's so bad in volume, right? So by the end of the week, everybody was back to original Coke, which they were finding, in abandoned sheds all over the world or whatever. But there was a brand thing that they ignored, but more than that, it was just one short validation based on a sip of a sweet drink is not good validation.
Well, what's the old line? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so if we're relying on statistics, whether it's through a taste test or a survey or whatever it may be, we can make the numbers say what we want it to say. Of those people with a high preference for X, 90% of them said yes. Well, of course they did. They have a high preference for X, right? We frame it.
Mm-hmm.
That actually worked out to their advantage, though. If you remember, there was such a big pushback on that at the end of the day that it actually got them so much. There's the old adage, there's no such thing as bad publicity. So they ended up getting a huge amount of positive publicity out of that. And then they increased their regular sales above what they had before because of it. So it was an interesting dynamic. Some people said they did it purposely and it was all around a marketing plan. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But certainly at the end of the day, it worked out for them.
Well, and we'll just see how X works out for Elon Musk.
All right. So what a good conversation. Any last thoughts on the first question? How do you best use validation to improve product success before we move on to the poll?
I want to go back to something Leslie said. And it was that if you are building and testing before you launch, like with actual customers, I think one of the things that you're actually doing is experimenting. And I think one of the, we talk about all these ideas like discovery and whatnot, but I feel like one of the pinnacles or ideals of product management is if everything that you build is an experiment with an intent to do that testing. So like if you build in validation within everything that you do, like it's like we're going to build this feature and here's how we know it's successful, right?
Mhm.
That way you always know that you're measuring. Like it's that intent. Where is your intent to measure? It's like it's not, it can't be an afterthought. It needs to be like a thing that's innate in us, where it's like we're gonna build this thing and here's the outcomes and here's how we want to measure it.
Well,
So I
and
think like yeah.
even before we build it, we should have done some level of testing on the concept, right?
Yeah,
Is
but
this the right
it's
problem to solve?
but if
Yes.
we're talking about validation, right? It's not is this the right problem to solve? It's like what is the outcome of solving this problem? Like it's answering
Mhm.
the question of like what is the outcome we want to achieve? And that's like a level of validation. But really like because I come from the world of validation is a heavy idea.
Yep.
I feel like validation needs to be more on the reality side. Like even if you're
Mhm.
doing that test of like, you know, doing that little discovery activity of saying whether or not this is the right idea, yeah, you can have conversations, but you're probably going to build like a small prototype, maybe a mock-up, maybe just like draw with your clients or whatever. Whatever it might be, that activity, right? Like you're thinking about the outcome, you're thinking about how do we validate. So
Yeah, I get it. As I think about it, it's like the test. I want to find a way to get thinking in bets, right? Annie Duke really changed my perspective on sort of strategy. Everybody uses chess as this sort of example of strategy, but in chess, you know what the outcomes are. The grand masters know exactly what they're going to do based on everything they've done. And they can play a whole game in their head. They have full knowledge, where in poker you don't have full knowledge. You're making decisions without full knowledge, which is really more akin to what we're doing when we talk about this stuff. So how do you these experiments, these tests all should be giving you a better confidence in the bet you're going to make? Does that make sense what I'm saying? I'm trying to find the right way to work it into this, but I think that uh, you know,
Well, let me take it a different direction while you're thinking about it. I really like something I've been seeing in the last year or so of people putting questions on their roadmap instead of answers. Would we retain more customers if we made onboarding easier, as opposed to make onboarding easier? And I'm even wondering about whether we want to add company outcomes to problem stories or user stories. Will this help us win new customers? Will it help us keep our existing customers? Or will it help us grow the adoption of our product with customers? And if it doesn't do one of those three things, why are we doing it? I mean, even their tech debt would be a thing that would help you retain customers, or redesigning your interface would help you keep customers, and perhaps win new ones, right? So it's kind of just something I've been playing with, but I really like the idea of, instead of saying new user onboarding as something planned for our next development phase, putting it as a question. Could we improve this, and would it result in retention?
I like that.
So let's just say I started that whole thing off with I agree with May again.
As I said, that's a very common statement.
I've actually been thinking about that quite a bit lately too. We were just in a big meeting yesterday with our sales and marketing team, and they were talking about goals and KPIs. And I said, well, I think we need to think about goals and KPIs from different perspectives, because there's the goals and KPIs that we want to achieve for the company with our product that might be measured in revenue, that might be measured in growing thought leadership or whatever you want to do. But then there's also the goals and KPIs that you want to do with the product itself, as gaining adoptance or being able to provide some new kind of value to customers. I've been trying to figure out how to put all this in one one thing when thinking about road mapping and such.
Yeah, and we've talked before about how do you measure this value you create for your customer. If you can actually get to the point where it's not just you're measuring their usage, you're actually measuring the value created. You know, every time they use it, they save 10 minutes. Every time they use it, they improve their decision making. Right, getting to that level of understanding of value, both for the customer and market, but internally for us and where it gets us as a company is such a critical thing to do. And for people to think about. One of the places where I think that a lot of product managers don't think in that lens or in that place. So what a great conversation on the Monday question. Let's go to the poll. We did the poll on Wednesday. And we asked, where do you see the most value from validation efforts? Validating problems with a survey, validating product concepts through discussions, validating true interest from pre-do or prototypes, testing features after development pre-launch, or other. It depends. Sharing comments. Danny was the one who voted 11% for the other. It depends. She said, I think it depends on what you're validating, which in product management, everything's it depends, right? May, you went with testing features after development pre-launch. Talk to me about your vote.
I feel like if you could, I think that's the missing piece. A lot of the time, you know, we talk a lot about doing upfront work, but there's work afterwards, that after the launch. We put things on the roadmaps, and once it's done, we have to move on to the next thing, and we never go back to the original thing to see like whether or not it was the right thing. Did we do it right? Are we like 80% of the way there, but with another week we could make it 10 times better, right?
Yeah.
Like that small bit of validation we never do. And I think that's something that would be good for us to do, and also would be good for us to actually put into our actual plans. Like done is when validation is over. Done is when we answer the questions of like, did we actually achieve the outcome that we were going for? Done is when we've done our retro and think about like, what do we have to slot in to make this whatever we built really, really good? Or is it worth making it really, really good? Because like if nobody's using it, then we have a different problem, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is the thing that in terms of what product managers get to do is a huge piece, a missing piece of the puzzle. And because you're measuring, it's not about assumptions, right? You can validate your assumptions, but until you build the thing and actually send it out into the market, like it's not real. So I
Yeah.
feel like that's actually the most genuine impact you can make.
Yeah.
You know, that reminds me of a joke I used to tell in business planning. What you do in a business plan is just say you're going to make $1 billion. Since no one ever goes back to reread the business case because they didn't read it the first time, they just went through and looked at the pictures. You could say $1 billion and you turn in $1.92 in revenue, but nobody ever checks. And that's maybe an exaggeration, but still, I think you're right. I mean, we totally have to circle back around and say, we thought doing this new thing was going to matter. Let's be sure to validate that it in fact did matter.
Yeah. No, I like that. Steve, you had not voted when I pulled this. And the reality is everybody on this call, except for me and May, voted for the same answer. I wanted to give you a chance to say where you would have voted, or where you voted if you
Well, you know, just to be friendly, I'll join you on Predo prototypes.
Okay, just to be friendly to me, or just
well, it's that is you that voted for it, right?
Yeah, I am there.
Yes, I too was very taken with that the book that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
And yet, yeah, I'm waffling on my answer. I was just going to join you on prototypes, but I definitely personally have had much more value from discussions around what problem will this solve for you? What is the value of that problem?
the old switcheroo.
Yeah,
You feel like you're
sorry.
gonna come my way, and then you jump on with the bandwagon. I will admit, I think I voted for the prototyping partly out of, just to have a conversation, right? I think what surprised me the most about this was that there was zero. We always talk about, people always use surveys to validate. People always use the results from surveys to prove things. And not one person voted for surveys, which surprised me.
Well, I don't think they provide a lot of deep information. Yeah.
Well,
but
let me jump in on what he's saying. I think that product managers like to have conversations with customers, and I think marketing doesn't. So they like to do a survey because that eliminates the whole need to, engage with the market.
Well, a thought on the prototyping or whatever, if I'm understanding that right, and an example of one where it failed and one where it succeeded. IBM was going to do speech recognition way back in the 50s for executives, and they did the Wizard of Oz thing, where they faked it. They just had a typist behind there, and they found out that people didn't actually like it. The executives, wrong market or whatever. Conversely, there was a speak and spell in, I don't know, the 70s, and it was so novel that Texas Instruments back then would just say, here's 50 grand, go make a prototype of the thing that you think. And it was a huge success, but maybe you could have never, it was so novel that you could not have gotten feedback from somebody about the problem that it was solving, and you really had to have a prototype.
And actually, the IBM example is one of the examples he used of a prototype. So what he, in the book, he calls a prototype Alberto Savoia, I think is the guy's name.
I thought that was Latin for avoid the curtain.
No, could be. But he said a prototype is a pretend prototype. Too often we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a prototype.
Yeah.
Can we do something a lot cheaper? And Mechanical Turk is one of the ones, the fake front door or the landing page.
Just do a magic trick
in that type of stuff. And so
Yeah.
that's what he's
I
talking
want to
about.
agree with Clay and extend it a little bit. Well, shoot. I was concentrating so hard on jumping in that I forgot what I was going to say. It'll come to me in a moment, I'm sure. But continue on, Grant.
Back
I
to the
apologize.
votes. So I was being a little provocative with my vote, but I think what it is I did use survey some, and I always, because people say you wanted data, in my experience, most of my validation was in validating product concepts through discussions. That was a specialty of mine. If I feel like there are times where I may not have truly understood if it was a willing to pay. And I think prototypes would have been, again, it's also novel to me because I just read the book. But I think if I could add something to my arsenal that would have helped me do a little better job of validating that people would pay for it, and it was something they would pay for, I think that's something that I would aspirationally would have liked to have had. So we're going to get to the people who answered validating product concepts through discussions, and we're going to give you guys all a chance to defend it. Clay, I'll start with you because you
hang on. I want to jump back in. The other the thing I was trying to remember was validation, traditional validation sorts of research are no good with new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you have heard me tell the story of the Slinky. Remember the Slinky?
Mm-hmm.
It's Slinky.
Yeah.
Yes,
not one store would carry it because they didn't get it. And so he asked the big department store in Philly if he could have just a corner kiosk for a Saturday. And he set up a little seesaw so that the Slinky could walk down it, right? He sold every single unit he had made. And in the space of like less than 10 years, sold basically one Slinky to every person in America. And yet all of the feedback he got was negative, but he knew from the neighborhood kids that they loved it, but he couldn't get anybody to believe it because their
kids
was not telling them, their survey wasn't telling them that people would want this.
Yeah, the kids were hiring Slinky to do a job that wasn't already being done. That's the problem.
A
And how
nice way of putting
often
it.
do we have a completely novel approach like Speak and Spell or the Slinky?
Yeah.
Right. And if you remember, the iPad was the same way until we saw it and we went, holy moly. Every other company was saying, we're going to build netbooks, which is like take a bad laptop and shrink it down and make it a shitty laptop. And that's now you have a netbook.
Well, really, the iPad was, we're going to put a TV in your lap.
In a way.
Because that's what everybody does with it. They just watch things.
There's something, there's probably a whole episode we could have on the problems to solve of different Apple products and how they're moving them up and down. Back to the poll question. Dutch, you also voted for product concepts with discussions. Talk to me, validating product concepts with discussions. Talk to me about your thoughts.
Well, being able to discuss things with customers or prospects or users is critical. I mean, yeah, sure, you can put out a survey and maybe that'll reach more people in less amount of time, but people are not as likely to spend the time and effort to expand upon their answers, especially if you only give them a limited number of things that they can checkbox or hit the radio button for a choice. Even what else would you like to say? They're not going to sit there and spend 10, 15, 30 minutes, writing out all of their thoughts. Whereas a discussion itself, if you're really trying to validate and then follow up with discovery of what next or how well this is doing it, sure, it solves the problem, but does it do it well? Is it something that you would pay money for? I mean, those other critical questions you can only really get honestly through a discussion and not a phone call, because so much of conversation or communication is nonverbal. And so being able to interact with another human in real time is the only way that you're going to get 100% accuracy or close to it for validating what you've done, what you want to do.
Yeah, and you made me think of another book, The Mom Test. And in The Mom Test, he talks about using emoticons in his notes, right? To talk about what were the reactions that people had. And it's you can't get that in a survey, maybe on a Zoom, better in person. But I think that, between seeing how they react viscerally, right? Their expressions, their interest level, that type of stuff, as well as seeing what skin they put in the game. Will they refer you to other people? That type of stuff. There's some things you can get in there which might maybe more implicitly give you validation than otherwise. So
yeah, and if it's a working either prototype or a working functional actual like pre-release version or something, doing a shoulder surf and like watching how they will use the product is much better than you running the demonstration saying, oh, hey, now this is where we go, blah, 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 or having something specific, like actually watching what their journey is going to end up being and what their experience is based on that.
Yeah, no, I get it. Paul, any thoughts you want to add?
So a couple things pop up, and to soften it with the Predo Proto, that is something that I've used in the past for something that as we described before, just didn't exist before. And the only way for someone to experience it is to have something tangential that they can then say, here's what that would look like in my world. Oh, wow, that would have really helped me last week, and start building that information up. And to Steve's point in the chat about people can only tell you what they did, that's where I think a lot of the conversations come in for me. Teresa Torres gave a great example at one point about discovery, saying that if you ask people something as simple as, tell me about what's important about a pair of jeans for you, and then you ask them, well, how did you make a decision on the last pair you bought? And then they give you a wildly different answer than what they said was important.
Yeah.
And so when you actually look at behavior, it tells you a wildly different story that you can get out of a conversation. That a survey, people are trying to get the right answer. Like, oh boy, what are they going to think of me if I don't put this down? Kind of like political surveys, people think, oh man, what are they going to think if I say that I'm against immigration or whatever? So you get these wildly skewed things of what people think is the right answer for the particular question. Even with as articulate of a forked survey as I can come up with. It'll take me weeks to get through a bunch of different stakeholders. I could have 5 conversations and have 10 times the understanding in that amount of time.
Yeah, no, I love that. And again, in the mom test, they talk about have them describe what the last time they had to do that or make that decision. Clint, I want to go to the comment you made in the chat, sort of getting to what Clay had said. Different validation for different phase of the process.
Yeah, so one of the things that we haven't talked about is validation of the business case, right? We've been talking primarily on validation of the feature set. And I mean, as a product manager, anybody that's a good product manager can make a business case sing, right? I mean, it's relatively easy. And then you focus on the features and you don't focus back on the validation of the business case. So I think it's basically a dual process. You're looking at feature, function, value proposition as you're doing validation. But as you're doing that, you also have to ensure that you're still validating the business case, because I've seen products that absolutely meet the requirements, but they significantly fall off the business case for whatever reason. And that is, the business case, typically the way I've seen it is you do it, you present it, and it goes into a file, and then everybody's excited about developing the product. So I think it's incumbent upon a good leader in product management to basically make sure that you've got a dual track going down, that one has a direct implication on the other.
Yeah, and actually, if you go through the order, mine was almost in a process type order. Validating the problems with the survey was my business case type stuff. Let me get some quantitative stuff to put in a business case. Validating product concept through discussions, that's when I would go talk to people. Here's what we're thinking. Here's what we're thinking about. What do you think about this? Then I'd go to a prototype. Okay, each of these as stage gates, then finally into testing features. So I almost built this in a process realm. But I think that's the right answer, is that it depends on where you are in the process, what you can get the most value from.
Yeah, when I had product managers working for me, that was the key focus for me, was on the business case, right? Let's get that down, and then let's focus on how did you get there, what your assumptions, and then we look at what the features were, or the product requirements. So versus flipping it on its head.
Yeah, I wanted to get to one new question quickly before we went to the key takeaways. And May, I'm going to start with you, and maybe I wanted to go in and change it and just drop experiment or validation out and have it just, should experiments be part of a product manager's compensation? Steve tells a story about customer calls was part of his bonus. He had to make a certain amount. If experiments and validation help us reduce risk and make sure we're working on the right its and whatever it may be, should that be something we put into the MBOs or OKRs or whatever of the compensation, whether it's your MBO or your bonus? Should we be doing that, May? Should we be making this something that's so critical we comp them on it?
I feel like it is a part of your core job. So like, if you like a job, then it should, I guess, you get paid for it. You can't quantify it, right? Because there's small experiments, there's big experiments, there's experiments that takes years. Like yeah, smaller experiments are more important, but like you don't want to like do that thing where you pay people per code push, right? Like
Yeah.
you want to pay people for the value that they bring. And like just doing experiments, like, are you doing the right experiments? Are you doing the experiments well? Are you actually driving business outcomes with it? Like, no, I don't know. Like, it's a weird question.
And maybe Steve and I were working on it, and we had many iterations. Maybe is it like, how do you better build experimentation into the day-to-day of product management?
Well, like if that's your question, then that's different. It's more, how do you make time for it? How do you make time for people and say, okay, you as a team, done isn't done until you've like measured the outcomes of what you launch, leading, lagging, whatever it means, but we have to build in that time into the system of how we work. It can't just be built this and then the next thing and then the next thing. Like we're talking about a product here. Like,
Yeah.
even within Scrum, like how does that work within the larger organizational framework? And it's a question that everyone needs to ask themselves, like not just product, beyond product.
I like that. Any last thoughts before we go to the key takeaways?
One thing that jumps out to me is if we were to look at that in the same way that generating leads is a good thing for sales, but you don't just want to fill the hopper full of garbage. So understanding that where are you finding friction in your process of learning? And then what do you need to do to solve that? I'm not sure if there's a great way to turn that into a KPI, but you certainly wouldn't want to just suddenly flood your system with stuff just to have more stuff.
So how, maybe saying we want more experiments, but we want more quality experiments. So there's some way to measure the efficacy of, right?
There's some downstream thing that can be measured to validate and provide feedback.
Well,
But,
and maybe the hope is that if you encourage them to do some experiments, they will use them wisely.
That's a good hope.
That's a good call. And I was, the situation that Grant was talking about, I was in a new role and my boss had seen what had happened to another product manager who came on board and was immediately inundated with development support and sales support requests. And he said, we don't have any good market insights. We have some reports that we've purchased, but nobody has been doing customer discovery without a sales objective, meaning nobody's been doing customer discovery. And so he's like, to make sure you understand how important I think this is, I'm going to pay you your bonus on making your 10 calls every quarter. And when I say 10 calls a quarter, half the people I talk to go, oh, yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. And the other half go, I'm lucky to get one a quarter. And the part that the joke part that Grant didn't tell was almost instantly my wife got involved in this compensation plan. And she's like, how are we doing on our customer visits? Because, baby needs new shoes.
Well, put your money where your mouth is, right?
Yeah. And I think where we were going with this was, how do you start building a culture where it's expected of you to do this stuff, right? Where I believe validation experimentation is something that is on the list of things we should do. It's one of the first things to get dropped. It's easy to drop it because people have gut feel or they don't have time or they don't have money.
And that's why we put continuous learning at the center of Quartz.
There you go.
And I would also add, Grant, that it shouldn't just be done with customers, right? I mean, service is critical. Are you doing design for manufacturing? Are you doing design for service, depending on if it's a hardware, software platform? So you also have to look at who you're validating with to make sure that you're not ignoring a critical subset of your customer. Because at the end of the day, service is a customer, just like your client.
Completely and totally agree. Let's move to the key takeaways. What's your biggest learning or takeaway from this conversation? I'm going to start with Clay.
I think that all of the responses are appropriate at different stages in the process. Yep, and you have to be very careful about what question you're trying to answer, right? A survey is confirmation of something that you've discovered. Discovery calls different, et cetera, et cetera.
No, I get it. Clint.
Just that it's critical, all different phases, and making sure you're talking to the right people and using the right methodology during what phase of development you're in.
Love it. Paul.
I think like most weeks, I learned that we need to make sure we understand the word the same way. The validation has been taken by everyone to mean something just a little bit different.
That was where I was heading with that. Yeah, Dutch.
Similar. Validation can be a phase that is that happens in a life cycle, but in all honesty, validating and learning are probably the center of Quartz.
Ooh.
Oh,
May.
I think we need to do a bit more work in terms of building in experimentation in everything that we do. Because if as we talk through this, it's like validation as an activity, but it's not an activity. It really should be like, if you're building something, it's a test, it's an experiment. If you treat it as such, your experiment isn't over until you actually go and measure your results and report on the outcome and share that, right? Like maybe validation isn't for you, maybe validation is a way of communicating what you've learned.
Oh, I like that. My friend Steve.
Well, gosh, I'm going to do a yes and, I guess. I mean, yes, language is so important. What you mean by a word and what I mean by a word is often very different. And I think it's a good reminder. But certainly, my key takeaway is we should not think of learning as a periodic thing, but as a continuous thing.
Totally agree. I was starting at the beginning when we started these key takeaways where Paul went, right? Is maybe we need to be better about our words understanding. And I think what I evolved to just hearing everybody's answer is this is not, maybe we do need to change the language. This is not about validation as it is about reducing risk, about helping us make better decisions, making better decisions with limited information, making better bets, and sort of where Paul started with this whole conversation with understand sales, right? Yes, no may not be the right way to do some of these things. Maybe it's about what at each stage, it's what information do we need to know to make the decision, to make the better, to feel more confident about the outcome we're trying to get to. And so if we do outcome-based experiments and tests that help us make better decisions, maybe it pivots us away a little way from validation. As throughout this whole call, I've got so much stuff in my head right now that I'm going to have to process. But great conversation, great panel. Clay, Clint, Paul, Dutch, May, my friend Steve. Great conversation. We're actually going to go on a holiday. We're going to take the rest of August through Labor Day week off. So there is no topic for next week. It's our holiday period. Not that Steve and I won't be around in the community, but we will. But when we come back the week of September 11th, as with every time we do this, on Monday, the question goes into the community. On Wednesday, we do a poll. On Fridays, we have these amazing conversations where you guys bring it. We all learn. We all have great conversations. And I thank each and every one of you for that. And I'll see you guys in the community. Have a great weekend, everyone.